morning is an issue that has come up over the years on what we refer to as evolution. And let us simply review this for a little bit. This particular term, referred to as evolution, is simply the gradual change within a population through time, where in a given species, maybe there's a geographic barrier that has been set up, and organisms, if it's an island, on one side of the island cannot necessarily mate with the ones on the other side of the island. Perhaps a mountain range, perhaps something of this type. And over the natural selection works on both populations. Maybe on the side where it's the windward side, those particular forms, if they're flying forms like perhaps bats or insects or birds, once they fly, the winds carry them out to sea. They become fish food in time. And you slowly have, on one particular side of the island, what we refer to as flightlessness essentially coming about. And over hundreds of thousands of years, many of the forms there simply do not fly. We find this at present on various islands where the insects simply do not fly unless they're recent introductions. You find the same on mountain tops, Kilimanjaro, the Alps, places like that. Insects there, if they fly up, are blown away, perhaps into a valley somewhere, and those that stay and do not fly are the ones that pass on their genes. So things of this type, just a gradual change within a species, within a population, within a species through time. This is essentially what evolution is. And for it is a topic which came about during the time of the Greeks. I guess God is a little perturbed at me for this lecture this morning, but things of this type will go on. So Darwin did not come up with the concept of evolution. Darwin came up with a working mechanism for evolution, that being natural selection, which is sometimes referred to as survival of the fittest, and sexual selection. This came about by our little friend Charles Darwin, an Englishman that again was born on the same day of the same year as Abraham Lincoln. In other words, February the 12th, 1809. Now, we got The Origin of Species published in 1859. Little book of this type here, exactly the same size. This is about the 6th edition. I believe I passed it around to you. And this particular cover here on the last edition is somewhat orange or some shade of brown and red. When the book came out, there was considerable discussion on this. Discussion had been on evolution back in Lamarck's time in 1798 and 1802. And Lamarck and his inheritance of acquired characteristics, the giraffe, the long neck, things of this type here. That did not work as a mechanism for evolution. Charles Darwin came up with a mechanism. There were debates over this during Charles Darwin's time. The great debate in Oxford University between Thomas Huxley and Bishop Wilberforce. Others had read the Bible 100 years before, and it determined that the earth was created, again, in the year 4004 BC, which happened to be October the 23rd at exactly 9 a.m. in the morning. This happened to be a Sunday, and people were working on this, the calculations of Bishop Ussher. So there were many in Charles Darwin's time that were thinking that the earth was only about 6,000 years old. As time went on, we began to get more scientific evidence. No, the earth was not 6,000 years old. It wasn't 10,000 years old or 100,000 years old, but we had to consider it in millions and even hundreds of millions, even billions of years of age. Now, groups that were religious groups were absolutely disgusted with this. To them, they were the fundamentalists. They were the ones that believed in the literal translation of the Holy Bible. As time went on, the Anglican Church, Episcopalian Church, the Roman Catholic Church, the Jews, they accepted evolution. No problem if you're a Roman Catholic. Check out with the Catholic Archdiocese. The Pope said, this is fine, it's not in conflict. But other groups still maintained, no, that which is in the Bible is absolute God's truth. And it cannot be disputed in any way, shape, or form. These people are still around today, especially here in the United States. This controversy is not a controversy in England or Austria or Germany or France or throughout most of the world. It's here. And it's because of groups that we refer to as fundamentalists, which are groups that, again, push fundamentalism, biblical fundamentalism. Now, what I want to do this morning is, first of all, give you a brief history of myself when I first started teaching, and then to go into this. My own background was that I was raised a Roman Catholic. I was sent to a Catholic school, a small Catholic school on the corner of Vermont and Adams. That's where I grew up, South Central Los Angeles. And there I went through apologetics, which was the proof of God without any reference to the Bible whatsoever, just logic. I read St. Thomas Aquinas. I read St. Augustine. I read things of his time. Some of you have been raised Roman Catholic. The Catholics don't push the Bible, and they really dissuade their flock to read the Bible and interpret it. They said, you start to try and interpret the Bible, you're going to probably get in trouble. Let us in Vatican City interpret it, and the Catholics also concentrate on what is referred to as a New Testament rather than the Old Testament. So you go to church, you go to Mass, and what do we get there? We get a portion of an epistle, a portion of a gospel, and that's about it. But it's not reading the Bible. There is a branch of Catholicism today that calls themselves the charismatic Catholics, which are more or less getting back to the Bible. But the general Roman Catholic Church, no. So I now start teaching decades ago, and my students are people like Noah, Jesus, Buddha. I remember all of them very, very well in this particular class of mine. And at that time, I'm at Glendale College, which is a Protestant area in Los Angeles, and I give lectures on evolution. And young students raised their hands at the end of the lecture. They were very kind. And they said, but what about the other point of view? I said, what point of view? They said, biblical. I said, biblical? You should be studying theology, or you should be studying and bringing these questions up in philosophy, not biology. No, we want the other point of view. And I realized that I had never read the Bible. So, went home, and I had married a woman that was raised a Southern Baptist, Catholic, Roman Catholic, Southern Baptist. Interesting life. We will have been married now 40 years this summer. And I asked my good wife, do you have a St. James version of the Bible? It's a version that came out in 1611, 1612, a very, very good version. This is the one the Protestants use. She said, sure. She got me the Bible. I again sat down with a big yellow pad and a dictionary. There were certain terms I did not know in the Bible, and I started to read it. I, of course, fortified myself at that time with a six-pack of Coors beer with 16-ounce cans. I had myself a slide rule. We didn't have the calculators at that time. They were big, but not the devices you have today. And I read Genesis 1, Genesis 2, Genesis 3, 4, 5, and finally Genesis 6. And a smile came to my face when I read Genesis 6. Now, let's look at this. First of all, we have what is referred to as science. There are certain rules of science. There's calculations that we make. There are various experiments that we do. We, again, use controlled and experimental portions of our, say, test animals. And there are certain rules we follow. And we try to be unbiased in this, and we write it up, and we release it to our colleagues. And if they criticize this, we take the criticisms, and the experimentation that is in there should be repeatable experimentation. All of the conditions that we had when we ran this. If we were working with birds, what was the temperature? Maybe how long did the study last? 6 weeks. What was the temperature in the room? Where was the room located? What was the longitude and latitude? What about the light? Did we have a 12-hour day, 12-hour night with a switch? Was there any light coming in to affect perhaps the bird periodicities? If we were using injectables like hormones, we had syringes. We would catch these particular organisms, we would weigh them, and then we would use certain concentrations of hormones, maybe in sesame seed oil, with one particular set, and inject them with so much of the particular hormone. With the other set, we would inject using a different syringe, different needle, again, simply sesame oil. We tried to do exactly everything except for one modification. That was one group got the hormones, the other did not. And then we would observe the behavior. We would observe the changes in plumage. We would take careful notes. Science is a hell of a lot of work. It's 95% perspiration and about 5% inspiration. And that is a quote from Albert Einstein. It is a lot of work. And it is something that follows natural law. Things that occur in nature. When in science, we measure. We look at organisms. We look at you. We put you on a scale. We find out what your weight is. We look at your eyes. We look at your height, your girth, things of this type. We have to put down everything that's there. We can check out phenotypes, maybe genotypes, on and on. This is science. And the stuff is, again, essentially repeatable. Now, when we go to the Bible, we don't follow natural things on this particular planet. The speed or perhaps the rate at which an object falls within a vacuum. A piece of lead and a feather will fall at the same rate. We don't follow this. In what we call religion, it is something called supernatural. That is, that it is above the laws of nature. Above the laws of nature. You cannot measure the number of angels sitting on the head of a pin. People have tried this. People have tried to measure how much the human soul weighs. Person is dying. They put the person on a scale. They get a particular weight. Then after the person dies, they put the person on a scale again. And they get the weight. And if there's a differential, then that particular differential is the weight of something that left the body. the so-called spirit, soul, or giving up the ghost. That is supernatural. The weight, by the way, that they've gotten on that is 21 grams. And they made a movie out of this. There is something that does disappear. But in religion, we deal a lot with miracles. Miracles are there, but they're relatively infrequent. In science, we run into frequency. We develop something or other, and perhaps in applied science, and work with it, and that's it. What has science given you? It's given you the clothes that you're wearing on your body. It's given you the Velcro. It's given you this and that and the other. The glasses that you may be wearing, perhaps the hearing aids. I doubt if any of you have them now, but later on in life you will. It's given us modern medicine. It's given us many, many things. So we have two different things here. We have what is referred to as religion, and we have science. Now, the two should be kept separate, but the fundamentalists say, no, we want this in science textbooks. We want it as the alternate to evolution. So let's go back, decades back, Tarvyd sitting there reading Genesis 1, Genesis 2, and so forth. I've brought a Holy Bible today, a big red book, beautiful, placed in hotel rooms by the Gideons, so now I'm really, really bad. I steal Bibles from motel rooms. But let's see what Genesis 6, what excited me at that time when I first read it. And in chapter 6 of Genesis 6, it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them. And the sons of God saw that the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. And the Lord said, my spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he is also flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. In other words, that's a longevity, how long people would live. Now, there were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of men came in unto the daughters of men, they bare children to them. The same became mighty men, which were old men of renown. And God saw that there was wickedness of man, and it was great in the earth, and that of every imagination of thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And it repenteth the Lord that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him in his heart. And the Lord said, I will destroy man, whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beasts, and the creeping things, and the fowls of the air. And it repenteth me that I have made them. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. These are the generations of Noah. Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations. And Noah walked with God. And Noah begat 3 sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. And the earth was corrupt before God. And the earth was filled with violence and graffiti and cocaine. Those are my additions. And God looked upon the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all of the flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth. And God said to Noah, the end of all flesh is come before me, and the earth is filled with violence, and through them, and behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Now, verse 14, make thee an ark, and make it out of gopher wood. Rooms thou shalt make in the ark, and pitch it within and without with pitch. And this is the fashion thou shalt make it of. The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits. The breadth of it shall be 50 cubits, and the height of it 30 cubits. And a window thou shalt put into the ark. And in a cubit shalt thou finish it above. And the door of the ark shall thou set to the side thereof, and lower and second and third stories thou shalt make in it.
And behold, I, even I, will bring a flood of waters onto the earth to destroy all flesh wherein is a breath of life from under heaven. And everything that is in the earth shall die. But with thee I will establish my covenant, and thou shalt come into the ark, thou and thy sons, and thy wife, and thy sons' wives with thee. And of every living thing, of all flesh, 2 of every sort thou shalt bring into the ark, to keep them alive with thee. And they shall be male and female, of fowls after their kind, and of cattle after their kind, and every creeping thing on the earth after his kind. 2 of every sort thou shalt come unto thee, and keep them alive. And take thou unto thee of all of the food that is eaten, and thou shalt gather it to thee, and it shall be food for thee and for them. Thus did Noah, according to that which God commanded him, so did he. And that's it. It's the story of an individual in religion named Noah. And 3 sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth, and 3 daughter-in-laws, unnamed, and 1 unnamed wife. Now, this is what the fundamentalists want in your science textbooks. Now, they will start with Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and all of the animals. Nobody's eating one another. They're all eating grass. Tigers and lions and bears are grass eaters in the Garden of Eden. And then an apple comes into it, and Eve, and a vocalizing serpent. Since then, snakes have never spoken, but in the Bible, you have the snake with vocal cords speaking to Eve. Of course, snakes today cannot hear. That a particular serpent apparently could hear. Now, with Adam and Eve, they populated the particular earth, and things got bad. And what happened then was that God got very, very upset and sent something onto the earth which is referred to as the deluge. What is a deluge? It is rain. And everything died except that material on the ark. So everything that is on this particular planet today, we trace back to Noah. We are all, according to the fundamentalists, descendants of Noah. Okay, in reading Genesis 6, there were things I was not familiar with at all. Now, number one, I had read various books. I had read about something called the Ark. And I always visualized it simply as a ship of some type. I didn't know what the dimensions were or anything. To my dictionaries, Webster's Unabridged, and there were several definitions for ark, and one would be a treasure chest in which one puts their most valuable possessions. Get a hold of, again, Webster's Unabridged. You'll find these definitions. That's number one. Number two, I had no idea what gopher wood was. It's specified in there. It's coming from the great commander, the creator. You will build this particular ark of gopher wood. It's only mentioned once in the Holy Bible, in Genesis 6. That's it. We do not know today whether it was oak or pine or cypress. That's it. There are speculations. About 30 years ago, a movie produced by the fundamentalists came out, and there was one particular individual in a white smock holding wood that had come out of the mountains of Ararat. And he said, obviously, this is Quercus. Well, Quercus happens to be the so-called genus of oak. It could have been oak. Could have been something else. We don't know. This is a big mystery. Now, in Genesis 6, it also mentions that this particular ark will be built in certain dimensions And these particular dimensions will be measurements in cubits. I had no idea what a cubit was. I found out it was a distance from here to here. Now, this sort of bothered me. There are pygmies in this world that have very, very short cubits. There are giants in this world that have very, very long cubits. So I began to look up the particular dimensions of cubits. It's the length of the forearm from the elbow to the middle finger. And there were various types of cubits that we refer to as English cubits. Now, the particular English cubits were 18 inches in length. There were also dimensions of ancient Egyptian cubits. And these particular cubits here were 20.7 inches in length. There were what we refer to as ancient Roman cubits. And the ancient Roman cubits were 17.5 inches in length. There are things referred to as ancient Greek cubits. And the particular ancient Greek cubits, again, differed. They were 18.22 inches in length. There were Hebraic cubits, and the Hebrews had cubits that they were using that were 17.58 inches in length. And, of course, there were Babylonian cubits used to build the Tower of Babylon. And these were very, very out of sync. They were 25 inches long. So different cubits. Now, about that time, I'd had my six-pack of beer. I decided to pick up a meter stick, and I simply measured my own cubit. And I put it down as a Tarvydian cubit, and it was 20 inches in length. And 20 inches was a heck of a lot easier to deal with than 17.58, then 18, then on and on and on. So I now looked at the dimensions given. The dimensions given were that this particular arch shall be, 300 cubits, was that it? By 50 cubits by 30 cubits. And I now took my little pen and I tried to figure out exactly what this particular structure would look like. And it was a structure that perhaps looked something like this over here. There was a door in the side in this fashion, probably very, very heavy beams to load this up here. And there was a superstructure. This was a particular superstructure here. And in this superstructure, there were windows 1 cubit from the particular top. Great. Now, over here, we had 3 stories, maybe 1 story, 2 stories, 3 stories. And according to the Tarvydian cubit, we had an arc that was 6,000 inches long, which translates to 500 feet, which translates to 1 2/3 football fields in length. It was 83.3 feet wide and 50 feet tall. 50 feet tall at 10 feet per story would be 5 stories tall. 83.3 feet in width would be essentially from the alley to the street, the dimensions maybe of a piece of property here in Santa Monica where our house is. And then the length would be incredible, 1 2/3 football fields in length. I looked at it. I tried to figure out how much wood would this take, gopher wood. And I determined it would take a hell of a lot of gopher wood. A lot. Forests. 450, 500, 600 trees. Thousands, perhaps, of trees. Now, I kept reading in Genesis. And I got the age finally of Noah. And Noah was 500 years old when he got the message. I looked at that and I said, wow, this really doesn't look too good. But he finished the ark when he was 600 years old. He had 100 years to build this particular structure. I looked at this a little more. I've taken some courses in senescence. I've taken courses in aging, courses in, again, people. What happens to people at different ages? And I asked you, first of all, how many of you have seen on television or have met a person who is 100 years old? Hands. Oh, good. We are 1/5 of the way there. Let's go for 2/5. How many of you have seen somebody on television or perhaps met somebody that's 200 years old? No more hands going up. Something's happened. Well, let's get up to 100 years old. At the age of 30 years old, you begin, Homo sapiens, to lose 10,000 neurons in your brain every single day. On day one of 30 years old, you lose 10,000 neurons. The day after your birthday, another 10,000 neurons, and on and on and on. So here's an individual of 500 years old that has 470 years of neuron loss, scientifically. Okay. If you are going to get bifocals, typically you will get them at 42 years of age. Your eyes will start to go and stuff. And by 42 years of age, the human population that has to have bifocals gets them. You can't see too well. I'm not too popular at parties. I go in and I look at people, and regardless of how many facelifts they've had and this and that and the other, I kind of guess their age. There's a certain amount of kidney failure that occurs. Hair loses its pigmentation. Hair falls out. Teeth fall out. Arthritis sets in. Rheumatism sets in. Other diseases. This is pretty bad. And that's all within the first 100 years. By 500 years, that's a lot of wear and tear on the body. Okay, so I looked at that. Now, with miracle, there is no problem with this, except fundamentalists want to remove miracle. They say we can prove everything that happened here without miracle whatsoever. Therefore, it should be in science textbooks. We as scientists say no, keep it with religion, keep it with mythology, keep it with philosophy, perhaps the history of religions, but not science. No, this is our alternate. Okay, so now we are at 500 years of age. Now, the message is given to 3 sons to help, and 3 daughter-in-laws, and 1 wife. And they've got to get up a plan. They've got to cut so many trees. They've got to drag these trees. They've got to split. They've got to make, again, various types of planking. They've got to dry a lot of the wood. They've got to shape it, all within 100 years. They've got to build corrals within 100 years. They've got to go out to various continents yet undiscovered and find the animals. And not only that, it has to be 1 male and 1 female. And the food you will put onto the ark shall be food for thee and for them. You've got to deparasitize each and every species of animal to 1 particular male flea and 1 particular female flea. It's mind-boggling. Others will say, well, Noah could have hired people to do this. Noah was a poor man. He had vineyards. He raised grapes. He simply did not. And he couldn't promise a ticket aboard the ark. There were only going to be 8 passengers. That's it. So this now was accomplished somehow or other. Individuals went out to continents, they got the animals, they defleed them, they loused them, they brought them back, and that was it. Now, you've got to get into the ark food, and it shall be food for thee and for them. Now, the ratio of food, if you eat 10 pounds of food, it essentially produces 1 pound of flesh in the wild. In the wild, again, you catch a particular fish, you eat it, you cast, again, portions of it away. Perhaps the operculum, perhaps the vertebral column, the ribs. This is all taken into account, and you've consumed, again, maybe 10 pounds of fish, but only 1 pound will be transferred into your own flesh. We have a little better ratio with things like Colonel Sanders, where maybe it's 3-to-1 or 2-to-1 in mass farming. And you've got to collect a lot of food for these animals, and the correct food. The koalas are going to eat eucalyptus. There are 500 to 600 species of eucalyptus in Australia. Koalas, again, only eat 24 species to 26 species. And they rotate throughout the year as to which particular species they're eating. And if they are very, very hungry and that eucalyptus has been picked and the leaves have simply evaporated away a lot of the water, and it's over 3 days old, they eat this eucalyptus, it messes up their kidneys and they die. You've got to have fresh eucalyptus, the correct species. You've got to have fresh bamboo for the particular pandas, and on and on and on. Now, 90% of that ark is loaded with food. You've got very, very little area here for animals if you look at it this way. But again, the particular day comes in the appointed time, and rains begin to fall, and the earth opens up, and water comes out of the earth. And this particular thing that we call the earth, the waters begin to rise and rise and rise. Here now is an earth. And the waters rise and rise until they are some 13 to 17 cubits above the highest of mountains. So now you have what is called a complete hydrosphere. The waters are 13 cubits above K2 and above Mount Everest. And the only things left on this particular planet are the things drifting around in the ark. The ark, by the way, is non-navigable. You don't have a rudder. You do not have a wheelhouse. You do not have any masts. You do not even have anchors. It's simply a long tube of wood, like a cigar tube, but made out of wood. And everything's been loaded onto this ark. Now, in dealing with the animals, and I don't know how many of you have grown up on farms and so forth, animals put out a lot of gas, especially the herbivores. So now we get collecting within the ark a bunch of gas. Gas is due to flatulence, which is, in this day and age, gas coming out of the posterior end of the animals. But 100 years ago, it was gas coming out of either end. Burping would be flatulence and so forth. Today, it's rectal gas. So let us look at this. We can call it the F factor, if you wish. And let us analyze what this is made of. And we have in here a certain amount of water vapor, a certain amount. We have in here a certain amount of carbon dioxide. We have in here hydrogen sulfide. That is what gives the so-called characteristic odor to flatulence. But more important, we have in here something referred to as methane. And it is this methane that we are dealing with right here. This stuff is volatile. You're aboard the ark, and if you light a particular branch or a torch with a flint, it possibly can blow up. Your only, again, ventilation is ventilation through here. So you have buildup of this. Now, I used to lose sleep over this one. You're stumbling around in the ark. It's going back and forth. Animals are throwing up, barfing their insides out, and all this flatulence, and you can't see. Okay, so I had to figure out lighting for the ark. Well, bioluminescence. Why not? And there are certain types of cyanobacteria that bioluminesce. So now I have this eerie type of bioluminescence in here. This is solved. Another thing that has to be solved, there are a lot of steps to climb to throw what we call waste overboard. They're constantly shuffling and shuffling. Again, go to a farm sometime. And you can't save this waste material. It goes overboard. So we have now this. Now, it rained for 40 days and 40 nights. The rains came, the water flooded the planet, and the ark floated around. But it did not settle onto any land until about 8 months later. Read the Bible. It's an 8 to 9 month voyage, spinning around here and there, not going anywhere. Finally, it stops raining at the end of 40 days and 40 nights. However, the waters are still there. And Noah is getting awfully tired. And so are Sham, Sham, and Japheth. And so are the daughter-in-laws and the wife. And so Noah now takes a bird. And the first bird he takes is a raven or crow, a corvid. And he sends the bird off into the distance. And the bird finally comes back. It's exhausted. Lactic acid is built up in the muscles and everything, and it settles, and there's nothing there. Lets a couple of weeks go by. Takes a dove, sends it out. That dove also comes back with nothing. Finally, on the third flight, another dove goes over the horizon and brings back something in its bill. What did it bring back? An olive branch. How many olive trees do you know of that grow underwater without miracle for 8 or 9 months? Where did the olive branch come from? Regardless, here it is. Noah now knows that there's land somewhere. Waters are subsiding. Where are they going? Back into the mantle. The mantle today of the earth does not have water within it. Did it at that particular time? The creationists say, yeah, it did. Now, eventually this ark settles. And it settles onto various mountains, one of which is referred to as Ararat, formerly located in what we call Armenia, today located in Turkey. The mountain didn't move around, the geography lines moved around. Now, here is big Ararat. Here is little Ararat. Generally, the fundamentalists say it's on the top of big Ararat and it's locked in ice. Well, let's go back to the time of Noah. Everything settles, and we open up our little kiddie Bible books, and there are Noah and the lions and the tigers and the bears looking over Noah's shoulder. And there are beautiful rainbows, and now they're saved. And there are trees there and stuff like that. No, there's nothing out there. Everything's been destroyed. You have something called primary succession and secondary succession. Little seeds, if they can, have to sprout. Little grasses have to come up. Eventually, little bushes have to come up from other seeds, small sapling trees, bigger trees. And eventually, you reach climax communities of ecosystems, which can take as long as 700 or 800 years. It's a long time to feed the animals with what food you have. Then they can be distributed. Now, do you take them back where you picked them up?
Did the kangaroos go back to Australia? Did the koalas go back to Australia? Did the anteaters go back to perhaps South America? Do you take them back there? What about the biogeography as we know it today? What does Noah do at the end of the voyage? Oh, by the way, there's also a problem with all of the soils being polluted. In a way, they're fertilized. Everything's died, it's rotted out, and it has precipitated down. And this is why we find fossils on the top of mountains, according to creationists. Or God put them there to test man's faith, or the devil put them there to drag you away from God. These were the explanations given. But the oceans of the world had dumped their salt content on everything. Think back to the days of the Romans and Carthage. And the Romans got a little pissed off. And they finally took Carthage, and they simply put salt around all of the Carthaginian soils. And as, again, rumor goes, not a blade of grass grows there today, a little over 2,000 years later. But these are the things taken care of by Noah. Now, this is essentially the type of things that the fundamentalists want in science textbooks. It is the Bible. That explains everything. It explains everything. We, again, as scientists, pull our hair out. We say, no. Now, 30 years ago, they called it fundamentalism. And it was creationism. Today, it's called intelligent design. And you go to various states like Kansas, like portions of Pennsylvania, that vote in school boards that believe, again, in creationism. We have 10 people in the school board here in Sacramento in California. They're the ones that decide what particular textbook should be used. 5 of them are creationists. 5 are not. And the battle goes on and on and on. And the rest of the world looks at us and shakes their head. They really shake their head. Now, there are some interesting books available. One is Great Feuds in Science. And there are feuds that took place back in the time of Charles Darwin, back in the time of first evolution and natural selection coming in. And some of these are certainly worth reading today as they were when they occurred initially. About half the people in the United States, when surveyed, number one, they fail certain very basic tests. They believe that man, Homo sapiens, and dinosaurs were contemporary. They also believe in Adam and Eve and creation. They see no problem whatsoever in putting things in the Bible into science textbooks. We as scientists say, for God's sakes, leave the science alone. And leave, again, the Bible alone. If you want to go to the Bible, or there are problems with my lecture on the ecology of Noah's Ark, go to your priest, go to your rabbi, go to your minister, go to your mullah. Have them answer it for you. If you have a question on science, go to the scientists. But this is big problems we're having. We have here in the United States of America probably the greatest higher education system in the world. Graduate school, the PhD level, the master's level. People come in from all over the world to study here at these levels in the United States. Yet, from kindergarten through 12, we are lacking in our education. There are kids that are, again, in a 10th grade or perhaps a 9th grade that know nothing about Charles Darwin, except maybe what they learned in Bible school. This was a man that was walking around and came up with this evolution that should not be looked at. In other words, 666 was probably tattooed into Darwin's skull as it is in Tarvyd's skull, you know. So this here, again, keep science with science. Keep religion with religion. There are different rules. Religion is supernatural. It is philosophical. It is theological. Science is something entirely different. Thank you very much. Now, undoubtedly, some of you have questions. I will entertain questions at this time. No questions. I've had other students ask me after hearing this particular lecture, would you put one together on the ecology of the Garden of Eden? I will one of these days. And then what is the carrying capacity on this particular planet? Well, on and on and on. But it's very, very interesting. If you haven't read the Bible, read it. Look at it. But the fundamentalists, again, believe in direct interpretation. We have about 58 million people here in the United States that are identified as fundamentalists. It's 58 million plus. Many of these people are people that each and every evening listen to their local minister in Texas or Louisiana or perhaps Arkansas. And they believe everything they hear. They, again, will make out Social Security checks, this is all they're living on, and send it to that particular minister and his or her particular point of view. We have, again, a president that is very, very interesting, but he also is a fundamentalist. He's seen the vision. Well, this is fine, but don't squeeze it into science textbooks. Know the difference between science. Know the difference between pseudoscience. What is pseudoscience? People that have something where it's sort of on a guise of science. What? Astrology. Astrology is quite different from astronomy. And on and on and on. Evolution permeates all of our lives today. The age of the earth, and again, 4.5 to 4.6 billion years of age. But we have it in, again, biology. We have it in medicine. We have it in DNA. You could not go back to the fundamentalistic point of view and believe in Star Trek. Why? Because the Enterprise actually went to galaxies and far, far away that were over 10,000 light years away. According to the fundamentalists, what we call geological dating, radioactive decay, carbon-14 does not exist. It's wrong. Carbon-14 would typically date things back to about 50,000 years. Doesn't go back any further. And if it dates something at 20,000 years, no, it's impossible. Because the Bible and interpretation of the Bible, the way they look at it, says this is wrong. So it permeates, again, geology as we understand it, astronomy as we understand it, medicine, us becoming resistant to various types of drugs, on and on and on. People say, well, the fossil record is not complete. Well, there are very few people working on the fossil record. I know 40 years ago, there were only 100 professional vertebrate paleontologists working in vertebrate paleontology in the entire world. That's China, Russia, Ukraine, everything put together. Today, it might be 200 vertebrate paleontologists. Fossils come about, again, it's very, very hard for fossils to come about. Most life forms on this particular planet that lived and died did not become fossilized. We might only have a record of perhaps 1% of the species that ever lived. And to put together a fossil would be like taking a human skeleton and destroying half of it, throwing an arm away, a leg, and only taking half of it, and then taking a sledgehammer to it and breaking it all up, and then going into a football field and sewing bones in one direction and another, and maybe covering this up now with fertilizer. And you've got to collect all these pieces, and you only have half of a skeleton. Now, maybe somebody else did this with the same species halfway around the world. Eventually, we get the entire thing. This is a lot of work.
societies do not pay for big vertebrate paleontologists. They might be excited about some fossils, like dinosaurs, and we have to rely on Hollywood to tell us, how the dinosaurs did this. You all undoubtedly looked at Saturday morning television, and you learned words like Tyrannosaurus rex, Brachiosaurus, Brontosaurus, Seismosaurus, Pterodon, on and on and on. But this is what we have. Now, any questions now? Okay? Now, we still deal with evolution. We still want to know, be a scientist or Christians or born-agains, how things came to be on this particular planet. And one that worked on this back in 1935 and before was a Russian. And his name was Dr. Oparin. And Dr. Oparin was a biochemist in Russia, working away, and finally in 1935 published a book entitled The Origin of Life. In fact, I even had a mention on your last examination, but everybody else that was mentioned had lived the century before and was dead. And so this was a non-entity as far as the exam was concerned. Now, Oparin felt that, number one, the early planet, 1 billion years ago, maybe, was in an environment where you had the Earth, and you had a lot of gas which was surrounding Earth. You probably had already the beginnings of a core, beginnings of a mantle, and a very, very thin crust. And you had heat dissipating from this particular crust. Where did the Earth come from? It's a piece of the sun. It originated from the sun. And it sort of condensed, and then there was an object captured by gravity that may have had some other origin called the moon. But the atmosphere, 1 billion years ago, was an atmosphere that was an anaerobic atmosphere. This means an atmosphere without oxygen. Had early biochemicals developed, and oxygen was present. It would have oxidized these early chemicals, and life would not have occurred. It was only after a long time that the atmosphere become an aerobic atmosphere. Aerobic is in the presence of oxygen, anaerobic in the absence of oxygen. And Oparin felt that there were energy sources coming in the form of, again, lightning. But you had what we refer to as electricity as an energy source. You had what is referred to as heat as an energy source, maybe heat from within. And you also had another energy source would have been radiation. And a lot of this radiation would have been cosmic radiation from the cosmos. We still have radiation hitting us today. Ever turn your TV set on, you have little flickerings and so forth? That is radiation from the Big Bang that actually comes in and screws up reception. And he felt, Oparin, that the early molecules here in this particular atmosphere were molecules of, again, methane, our old friend that bugged Noah, hydrogen sulfide. There are a certain amount of proteins that require the sulfur, like keratin, like hair. That the early atmosphere had hydrogen within it, that the early atmosphere perhaps had what is referred to as ammonia within it, and a couple of other very, very basic molecules. And as the Earth cooled, a lot of the water vapor, which was throughout the atmosphere, began to condense and fill up little concavities on this particular planet. And now you had oceans. And he felt this was enough to start life as we know it on this planet. Now, in 1939, on September the 1st, a man named Adolf Hitler invaded Poland. He had been running around Europe raising hell before then. But upon the invasion of Poland, it took him 1 month to defeat it, it brought all of Europe into the war. And World War II, generally within Europe, broke out on September the 1st. And Russia was really not into it. They had made a pact with the Germans that they would let the Germans take over Poland if they could have Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, the Baltic states, which would provide Russia with various ice-free ports within the Baltic. Within a year, Hitler turns on Russia and kicks them out of the Baltic states. And now Russia comes into the war attacking the Nazis. And Russia takes its best resources, including its biochemists, and Oparin is not thinking about origin of life. He's thinking about survival of his peoples in Russia. However, Oparin's book was translated into English. And in the year 1950 and 1951, there was an interesting individual studying for his PhD in chemistry whose name was Miller. His name was Stanley Miller. And he read this and he said, I think I can make up an experiment, a very simplistic experiment 55 years ago to test this hypothesis. Chemistry students in every university have to get permission from their major professor to run these particular experiments. His major professor was Dr. Urey, that happened to be a Nobel Prize winner. And Urey he looked at everything, he said, fine, run your experiment. So Stanley Miller simply got glass tubing, made sure it was quite sterile, made sure there were no residual amino acids and things of this type around here, and sort of set up in this fashion here. When he set this up, it was not a very, very large device. It could sort of fit into your hands. You could carry this. This was simply glass tubing. And it was set up like this. Now, he put a Bunsen burner under here, and he essentially generated heat. He had a fluid here. Inside this particular fluid was water, hydrogen, methane, hydrogen sulfide, some ammonia, things of this type. This would cause now the particular fluid to boil. And as it boiled, it sort of went up here, and it went around here. And as soon as it passed this area here, he had electrodes set up. But these particular electrodes now shot off electricity. So you had heat, you had electricity working on the very, very simplistic molecules. And then there was a condenser that was here. And it simply changed the temperature, and it caused all of this vapor that was going through here to simply liquefy. And as it liquefied, it simply poured down now the sides here and got into this area. Now, this whole apparatus was simply put into a closet, and it was locked. And it ran for about a week. Miller would always check to make sure that the flame was still on, and at the end of a week's time, he simply went to here, and there was a little tap, and he would get some of this particular fluid and see what was forming in here. And that material that had formed by chance in that fluid were adenine and thymine, cytosine and guanine, and uracil, all of the essential nitrogenous bases for DNA and RNA. You also found 5-carbon sugars, pentose sugars forming in here, things called ribose and deoxyribose. You found amino acids forming in here. You found also glycerin molecules and fatty acids forming in here and sugars by chance. Now, he published this. This is what we do in science. People around the world, we didn't have internet at that time, 55 years ago. People read this. They got excited. They took his results and took them a step further. A man in Florida simply added more heat, and he also varied the pressures. And he began to come up with proteinoids. He began to come up with more segments of DNA and things of this type. And this is what we feel was probably happening back in, again, the genesis of life on this particular planet. Where do we think it formed? In the oceans, probably within shallow oceans, maybe even within estuaries. Some of the silt within the estuary was often a nucleus to which amino acids and DNA would essentially attach. And so we look at it as a primeval soup as such. And this is what we feel was happening. Now, was it being guided by some divine being? We don't know. There's no way to test this. You don't use science to, again, establish the existence of God or non-existence. There is no scientific type of experimentation where you can prove the existence or non-existence of God or angels or devils. Science does not deal in those realms. Those realms are exciting when we see them on TV and TV shows, but it's really not science. So this is where we're at now. Now, one of the prime centers for the evolution of life on this planet has traditionally been UCLA. They've been working on this for some time. Now, Cambridge University, Darwin's alma mater, is working on it. Oxford is working on it. This is what we do in science. People that are fundamentalists would never allot monies for something like this. This is horrible. So, again, bring you back to Darwin. Darwin came up with this particular, the facts for how evolution proceeded. The working mechanism, and that was, again, natural selection and sexual selection. What Darwin came up with, we begin to find was true. It's true. Darwin's genetics was often criticized. Living at the same time that Darwin was living was the father of genetics, Gregor Mendel. And he published his observations on pea plants and dominant and recessive genes and things of this type, or elements, in an 1866 journal that happened to be an obscure mining engineering journal. Mendel undoubtedly had heard of Darwin. Darwin had never heard of Mendel. Darwin did not know about chromosomes. Darwin didn't know about DNA. As we find more and more and more, we put it together. And this is the way scientists work. Again, one layer, and a second, and a third, and a fourth. There is no such thing as a mad scientist working, a crazy guy on some island doing this and that. Needs a lot of backup, tremendous amounts of backup, tremendous amounts of money, money to take care of technicians, equipment, on and on and on. So this is science. Hopefully you'll remember what science is and think about it when voting issues come up in your life. You are going to run into these. Kansas, again, portions of New York, everybody's running into these. The creationists have permeated every board of education throughout the United States of America to decide what particular textbook will be used. And there's only one particular board that they haven't permeated, and that's Hawaii. And that's because of the high Buddhist population in Hawaii, and they just can't get in there. But the textbook companies, they work primarily on California and New York and what we call Illinois, because this is where the major populations are. And what's left over, then Tennessee and places like that have to pick it. Kansas, 5-10 years ago, decided they won't teach evolution in their science textbooks in biology.
And they were so happy about it. And their students then graduated from high school and they started applying to Harvard and Yale. And the Ivy League schools said, no, you have not completed the requirements. We're not going to accept any students from Kansas. So quickly, the Kansas citizenry simply got a new board of education and reinstated evolution. Now it's going back to creationists. And you will see this as time goes on. Darwin, again, is honored in different areas of the world. On a 10-pound note in England is Darwin's face. It's an old man. In fact, it's a picture much like this here. This is the autobiography of Charles Darwin that he wrote only because his children insist upon it. It was not meant to be published. It was. So there you have both Darwin, evolution, and creationism. Any questions now? No questions. I can imagine what's rattling around in your brains. Wait till I tell Father Flattery what Tarvyd said, what about this and that. One time I gave this lecture, and I went home, and I got a telephone call. And it was from Pacific Palisades, and it was a creation scientist. And he said, I heard your lecture, my son taped it, and I'm also giving a lecture in Costa Mesa. Would you like to come along? I said, sure, I'll come along. And he picked me up. My wife, my friends said, Tarvyd, they're going to crucify you. We'll never see you again. And we drove out to Costa Mesa. I helped him carry his audiovisual equipment in. They set it up, beautiful house. There was a cross on the door. And then the people began to come, 2 by 2 by 2, carrying their Bibles. And when I was introduced as Ed Tarvyd, one of them happened to mention, you're the one. I said, oh God, maybe my wife was right. I never will come back, you know. And we went through the lecture. It was a 2-hour lecture. There was a little break in between. And then they all turned to me, what do you think of it? I said, it is great. It is super. Fantastic, you know. On and on and on. And I said, however, there are problems. They said, what problems? I said, where are you going to put all the insects on the ark? Where? I mean, there's maybe 10 million to as much as 30 million insects, times 2. And they wanted to put them in a gunny sack and throw them. I said, you can't do that. The elephants will step on them. You know? And we went on and on and on and on. And they did not convince me of their, again, thing here. So this is what we have. Now, again, the people here who are taking the test today, be there at 1:30, and I should have, by Monday, most of the particular books and so forth, lab books and exams graded. I will bring these to room 134, and I will have a cart outside. You can pick up perhaps your examinations. I will be here tomorrow morning from 8 o'clock until about 9 or 9:15. That's all I can devote to it, and I've got to go out to Camarillo. Anybody else? Huh?
Are you recording the lecture?
It's being videotaped, too. In nomine Pater, Filii Spiritus Sancti, Amen. Thank you very much.